Shove it, man!
Alright, it's the Hawk. Nowadays in wrestling, the top companies have rosters full to the brim, and they have so many TV shows that wrestlers that are new to the business can learn their craft whilst on TV. This is actually a format which I do not agree with, as I think wrestling was better when the roster just consisted of guys who were actually television ready. It harms the reputation of the shows because it can often feel like you're watching a bunch of nobodies learning on the job. Whilst that's great for them, it's not so great for the audience. But before the days of NXT and AEW Dark, green wrestlers had to ply their trade in Developmental, and in WCW's case, they had the Powerplant. This place was famous for its brutal training regime, but it was also advertised as a path for aspiring wrestlers to make their way into WCW. At a cost, of course. I couldn't decide if this place was good for the wrestling business or not, so I decided to investigate and reflect on the Powerplant by making this video. But before we start, I would love to actually hear from anybody who had a Powerplant tryout. Let us know what trials and tribulations you endured. And if you don't, you'll get floored. The Powerplant was first set up in 1989 by former wrestler Jody Hamilton. In 1991 it officially became the WCW territory, and in 1995 it was relocated to Atlanta, Georgia. It was essentially a freezing cold warehouse full of rings. To be fair, for the 90s this place does look great, and I can't imagine there were many better facilities. This place was designed to keep pumping out talents, but for the few that did make it, thousands failed. I expect it was quite a decent money earner for WCW, as trainees were charged $250 to $300 for a 3-day tryout. If they survived the initial training, they're invited onto a 6-month course for the cost of $3,000. Quite the sum of money in the 90s. But the WCW Powerplant wasn't just open to any Joe Schmo. You were required to be taller than 5'9" and weigh at least 180 pounds. And herein lies our very first problem. Whilst the wrestling industry has changed a great deal over the years and smaller guys are now the norm, they were much rarer in the 90s, but the small guys who did make it onto telly were usually the creme de la creme. Wrestling works best with a variety of guys because variety is the spice of life, like a punch to the gut. By limiting the trainees, this meant that only a certain type of wrestler was likely to come out of the Powerplant. The Powerplant would mainly only produce powerhouse wrestlers. I will just point out, wrestlers who needed a bit of brushing up in their training were also sent to the Powerplant, but they weren't really considered Powerplant trainees. The plant's head trainer was Sergeant Dwayne Bruce, or better known as Buddy Lee Parker, although later Paul Orndorff was heavily involved. Despite Sarge's name, he doesn't seem to have much of a real military background on file, but he sure lives his gimmick. This guy just loved putting the trainees through brutal army-style training regimes. Vomiting in the Powerplant was common. He seemingly loved to make the trainees shut their guts up. Bruce was known to scream, insult, and really get under the trainees' skin. Slacking off was not an option in this guy's eyes. A mural on the door of the Powerplant read, "Pain is temporary, but pride is forever." The majority of the trainees usually quit on the first day. It had a whopping dropout rate of 85%. The brutal training methods were designed to push boundaries and weed out the time wasters. 50 squats followed by 50 push-ups followed by the same thing 3 times over was literally deemed the easy part of the training. Most of the day consisted of exercises to build up strength and stamina. By the time any actual wrestling training took place, the guys would have been battered and exhausted. I fail to see the logic in this training method. Somebody who can barely stand up is not going to be able to participate to their fullest in chain wrestling. It's like, well, I can barely even stand now, but you still want me to run the ropes? All the while, I'm being screamed at. Sounds like fun? It wasn't. The training was so hard that there are several well-known wrestlers who couldn't make the cut. Aaron Aguilar, who is Carlito's former bodyguard, Chael Sonnen from MMA fame, and Dave Batista, they couldn't handle it. Batista was told by Sarge that he'd never make it in pro wrestling. Batista speaks extremely negatively about the Powerplant and feels they tried to humiliate him. He called Sarge a bitter little troll for failing at wrestling. To be honest, it does sound like everybody who came through there was treated the same. This is another bad aspect to the Powerplant because there's more to wrestling than being in shape. Again, the Powerplant is only geared towards the ultimate body guys. Not to go off on a tangent, but last year the Hawk actually had some military style training of my own. It was probably the most humbling experience that I've ever had. You think you're hot shit until you're pushed to your limits and you realise that in reality you're just a weakling. Covered in sweat, every part of your body is screaming with pain, you can hardly breathe, you just feel like curling up on a ball like a demented hedgehog and crying. I literally could not get out of bed the following day. I only did it once a week for a fraction of the time that the guys at the Powerplant did. These training survivors must truly have been in exceptional shape. It's really helped me to respect Sonny Siaki even more. I've probably painted the Sarge in a bad light so far, but those who know him describe him as the sort of guy who was harsh, but fair. He took his job very serious and treated everybody the same. He was brutal because it was his job to weed out the time wasters. And as you'll see later in this video, it was some of his colleagues at the Powerplant who were the real bad guys. Now let's address the elephants in the room, as there were some guys who came through the Powerplant who went on to be mega stars in wrestling. The Big Show spent time in the Powerplant, but to be honest, to credit the Powerplant for his success seems like a reach. WCW signed the Big Show to a contract in 1995. He's spoken very little about his time at the Powerplant, and when he showed up to wrestle in WCW, he hardly looked skilled in the ring. In my opinion, WCW were always going to make the Big Show into a star regardless of his 5 Powerplant training or not. Whilst he was a lot more mobile back then, I highly doubt he could have survived the training drills, and I'm sure he would have been treated favourably down there, seeing as he was literally a giant and friends with Hulk Hogan. It's mentioned in Hogan's biography that Big Show only spent a short time at the Powerplant as they didn't want him to become a great mat wrestler. Hogan also didn't want the Big Show to do any more moonsaults. So my point is that the Powerplant is fairly irrelevant to the success of the Big Show's career. He was always going to make it. Diamond Dallas Page is another guy credited with bringing success to the Powerplant, but yet again, the Hawk finds himself torn over just how important the Powerplant was to DDP's success. He had already been a manager for several years in wrestling before he decided to become an actual wrestler at the age of 35. He had buddies high up in WCW and he would have known what was expected of him. Alongside that, it sounds like he had a lot of one-on-one training with his friend Jake the Snake Roberts. So whilst DDP is one of the biggest names to come through the Powerplant, I don't believe he had the exact same experience as the younger guys coming into the plant. I'm sure it was hard on him, don't get me wrong, but Page is another guy that I think would have made it no matter what. William Regal spent some time in the Powerplant when he moved from the UK to the States. He'd already been wrestling for years, so he was in shape, and it was likely more of a necessity for him to learn the American style. To herald him as a star the Powerplant created seems silly to me. Kevin Nash spent time there in the early 90s when he was nothing more than a master blaster. But once again, kind of the same stuff with the Big Show. Nash was always going to make it due to his look and size, and his in-ring work is the last thing people would praise him about. And the fourth and final biggest name to come through was Bill Goldberg. And this is the one that I think the Powerplant probably does deserve some credit for. He was not a name in the wrestling business at all. He wasn't best friends with high-up employees, and he wasn't already signed to a contract. Yeah, this guy had to actually prove himself as he battled down at the Powerplant for 4 months. He hasn't spoken much about his time down there, but for him to come in as a literal nobody in the wrestling industry and end up becoming world champion, I'm cool with calling Goldberg the most successful Powerplant trainee. Bret Hart would disagree. He thinks Goldberg's training was rubbish and blames the bad training for Goldberg kicking his head off and ending his career. But that aside, he did go on to be a star. A lot of smaller names in wrestling either started out at the Powerplant or received additional training here alongside their work in WCW. I want to focus on wrestlers who weren't doing much before the Powerplant, and the majority of their training actually came from this place. The obvious contenders for this would be a group known as the Natural Born Thrillers. Sean O'Haire, Mark Jindrak, Mike Sanders, Sean Stasiak, Chuck Palumbo, Johnny the Bull Stamboli and Reno. This was a group of young dudes who WCW decided to push almost immediately after their training. From that list of names, a few things do come to mind. They are mostly large body guys and not really known for their skills in between the ropes. Not only that, but other than Mike Sanders, they weren't great on the character side of things. He wasn't on the powerhouse side of things, so I guess it evens out. Whilst a case can be made for Sean O'Haire, we will never know how far he could have gone due to his sad demise. Ultimately, this faction of Powerplant graduates failed to impress and mostly bored people to death. It's like I said earlier on, a spot on a primetime wrestling show should only be for wrestlers who have reached the top of their trade and not those who are learning on the job. It was a sign that WCW was screwed as the older names were phased out and these trainees took up screen time. Many of the final Powerplant graduates ended up working for TNA. Names like Kwee-Wee, Shark Boy and Sonny Don't Look at His Ass Siaki came from the Powerplant. And as much as we all know and love them, it would be a bit silly to say they have had incredible wrestling careers. They did do okay, but they were never megastars. Siaki in particular has often caught strays for being a bit unsafe in the ring. AJ Styles was offered training at the Powerplant, but instead he chose to continue his job delivering water and working the indies. I mean, that didn't exactly go bad for him. He turned out to be great in the ring. Powerplant wrestlers could often be spotted on WCW programming performing in security roles. Most notably Russo and Bischoff security. It does seem that in its later years the height and weight requirements were dropped as smaller wrestlers like Jimmy Yang spent time here. A good chunk of the footage that you're seeing now came from the BBC documentary in which the presenter upset the sergeant, so he was destroyed with workouts until he puked. It is a very good watch and you'll see lots of familiar faces throughout, but there is a surprising amount of footage from the Powerplant available online. In the year 2000, a lawsuit was filed against WCW for their racism, and much of the lawsuit focused on the Powerplant. African Americans were routinely called the N-word, told that they couldn't make it in wrestling due to their skin colour, and they were passed over for opportunities. Powerplant creator Jody Hamilton is mentioned several times in the lawsuit, as is Terry Taylor, who worked at the Powerplant with him. A settlement was reached behind closed doors, pretty much admitting their guilt. Man, WCW can shove it. Imagine working hard to save up for your spot in the Powerplant, just to be treated like crap in the worst ways possible. The supporting evidence would be, well, just look at the amazing list of African American wrestlers who went on to fame after graduating from the Powerplant. Elix Skipper, okay, nothing wrong with him. Ernest Miller, okay, getting slightly worse now. Sergeant Craig Pittman. Hard Work, Bobby Walker. What does hard work even mean as a nickname? Does that mean that he's hard to deal with, or does that mean he works hard? No idea. Hard Body Harrison. Why is everybody hard down at the Powerplant? Yeah, that one turned out well, didn't it? Mixed martial artist Bob Sapp was actually at the Powerplant when WCW was brought out by the WWF. So really, with the exception of Elix Skipper, they all turned out to be jobbers. Ernest Miller was best buds with Bischoff and taught karate to Greaseball son Garrett Bischoff, so he can be discredited. Not only were opportunities limited for the African American athletes in the Powerplant, but it was also a horrible environment to work out in, and I'm sure it caused many talented trainees to quit. They just wanted to wrestle, man, why be racist to them? Since closing, the Powerplant has been condemned by Jim Cornette, Bret Hart and Dave Bautista. They all pretty much have the same problems with it, in that it didn't train the wrestlers in the ring properly. Not enough focus was put on protecting your opponent in the ring, and ultimately that was the issue. Once you've completed your wrestling training, you should in theory go off and wrestle on the indies for the next few years before showing up on telly. It's unsurprising that most Powerplant graduates failed when the main emphasis of their training was working out until you puke. If the training hadn't been so harsh and instead had more focused on the ring work and promos, the dropout rate would have vastly improved, and who knows, we may have seen some more guys come through. The Powerplant was seen as an integral part of the WCW business, but ultimately, I'm not sure it was worth it. For the amount of time and effort spent on it, it was really only Bill Goldberg who succeeded thanks to the Powerplant on a superstar level. Most of the other wrestlers who came through here were only ever playing bit parts later in the WWE. Nobody came out of this place with incredible wrestling skills. All they had really proven is that they were fit as a fiddle. Who knows how many potential stars that they ran off due to the grueling audition process. And the racist stuff is just vile. But that really only came out when WCW was winding down. By the time the lawsuits hit, WCW was no more, and WWE had to handle it. I do feel like the Powerplant was overall bad for business, and the later model that the WWE adapted seemed more sensible with developmental territories where wrestlers can do what they're here to do, which is wrestle. Do you think you could survive the audition process at the Powerplant? Let the Hawk know down below. I'd also be interested to hear from anybody who actually attended this place, because I'm sure there'll be one or two of you watching right now. Let us know your full grueling workout regime and I'll pin it. And if you don't agree with that, my teeth will start to grit.